when you get the next look at that name.
And in a shameless plea for sympathy, I will remind you all, well, I will ask you all to contemplate if it's annoying putting up with me. Imagine how annoying it is to be me. Okay. I'm going to talk tonight about Francis of Assisi. And once again, this is another session where I hope to cover two things, so I'll cover the next one next time. However, the context for them is the same because they're rough. They're rough contemporaries. This week's saint is Saint Francis of Assisi. And as always, let me give you a significant bit of background. And some of this background will be more useful next time, but I'm going to get it anyhow because I went to the trouble of putting it together. The nature of the period, the political situation, and so forth. Francis, oops, I'm looking for, darn it. Sorry, I did my last editing of this, proofreading and editing, late today. Francis was born in 1181, and this was an interesting and difficult period. It was not difficult the way some of the previous periods have been difficult. That is, a lot of poverty and a sense of backwardness and frustration. This was a period that was sort of difficult because things were changing and had been changing for about 50 years or so. The political situation, you've heard a lot about the clashes between popes and emperors. Well, that had become very much the center of political life in Italy, where Francis was. In fact, it had become so much the center of things that there are even names for the two power blocks. And those who were proponents of the Pope were known as Guelphs, and those who were proponents of the Emperor were known as Ghibellines. The political situation was, what underlay it to a large extent was the economic situation, which was getting better, not worse, in the sense that there was more production, there was a lot more trade, and this across Europe, but particularly in northern Italy, led to increased urbanization. There were these cities that thrived on trade. Some of them were trading out products that were produced locally, largely wine, to be honest, but also cloth. And some of them were thriving on the long-distance trade. The Venetians were trading to the east. They were trading wherever there was somebody who had something they could make a buck off of. Consequently, the cities were growing, and that meant that the countryside was not as heavily populated as it had been. This led to the rise of, this was part of which led to the rise of universities. And Italy's really kind of the home of universities. And they have an enormous impact. As far as the church goes, it was rich, and that could be good and bad. It was rich and it was powerful. A lot of people were taking very seriously the aspect of the Gregorian reforms, which were to make the Pope essentially the ruler of Western Christendom. That was being resisted by the Ghibellines, of course. Now, this problem with the Guelphs and Ghibellines was very complicated in that different cities would choose sides. And in some cities, different neighborhoods would choose sides. And there was a lot of political violence and even a certain amount of warfare going on. there was the reason that the Guelph and Ghibelline thing got sharper, that the contrast or the rivalry between popes and emperors got sharper, is in part because people were beginning to feel that we're too fragmented. We need to be united. That the greatest human advances had been made during periods when there were empires, and they were very strong central government over a large area. And you can see why this would be so. I mean, if you were trading, let's say you were a cloth merchant, and I didn't pick that one at random. The way the cloth business worked is you had certain people who were gathering the raw materials for the cloth, either raising sheep or growing flax, as well as a few other plants, but mostly flax. And then there were other people who were taking the various stages of manufacture to bring those raw materials to the point of being cloth. But that's not where it stopped, because people didn't want just raw cloth. They wanted colors. And so a lot of the trade around Europe was going from city to city, often over long distances, carrying undyed cloth or sometimes undyed raw materials to where the dyers were. And the dyers were people who guarded their secrets very, very carefully. I'm not going to go into detail because having worked at Mount Vernon in 18th century cloth making, I know way more than I ever wanted to know about cloth. If you are interested in cloth, I would suggest to you that there's a wonderful, really, sounds dull as dishwater, but it's a wonderful book called
The Fabric of Civilization.
Thank you, The Fabric of Civilization, which is about the history of cloth making. It really is a stunning book. So, that's, also, this emphasis on trade and the urbanization led to more and more dependence on a cash economy as opposed to a barter economy. And it was really, much of the economic boom that was going on was intensified by new developments in banking, lending, long distance transfer of value. You could get a letter from a bank in Florence and present it to a bank in London, and it would be honored. So you didn't have to carry your cash with you. But cash became extremely important in a way that it had not really been in a feudal economy. Mm-hmm. Okay. Starting in the late 11th century and going well into Francis's time, people began appearing around the West. Monks, clergy, lay people, who looked at all of this and said, this is wrong, this is bad. We're getting away from the gospel. We're getting away from service to God. We're becoming too worldly. Just look at the church. Look at how high a lot of the church people, a lot of the churchmen live. Look at how much wealth is being accumulated in cathedrals and monasteries. And they advocated a return to what they saw as the life of, that is, they saw as the life being preached in the gospel and practiced by the early church. This was referred to as following the naked Christ. They believed in community life, preaching to people to try to convert them to repent from their worldliness, and voluntary poverty. This is well before Francis. We all know Francis did those things, but this was really not that new. It was renunciation of the world. Some of these groups, which were initially suspected, although not condemned, of heresy, managed to integrate into the church, trying to reform it, trying to renew it from within. Others, who were more radical, questioned doctrine and ended up being persecuted and eliminated. A main point of conflict was this: who is allowed to preach? According to the church, you had to have a license to preach. If you were clergy, lay, or deacon, you were given a license. Occasionally, some lay people, like you remember Hildegard, would be given a license to preach, but that was it was very unusual. The church controlled preaching. Other groups advanced heretical theses right away. You know, they would popped up, somebody would be preaching things just absolutely nuts. And in 1184, there was a papal bull to prescribe excommunication for counts, barons, rectors, and consuls, that is, lay leaders like mayors of cities and other places who did not commit to repressing heresy. In other words, if you didn't commit to repressing heresy, your lands would be placed under interdict and you'd be in deep trouble. Now, there are a lot of factors that led to this rise of heresy. Partly it was the conditions that they saw and disapproved of. And then that was building, in a sense, on the reforming momentum of the Gregorian reforms. I spent so much time, I think, talking about the Gregorian reforms in terms of the life of the church and the church's rights and privileges as opposed to the state, that I really didn't, I know I mentioned, but I really didn't go into any great detail, and I don't intend to tonight, about the fact that there was also a move to reform, particularly to reform the monasteries, but also to reform the clergy. So this early urbanization, rise of the bourgeoisie, commerce, increased wealth circulation, and the intensification of certain social problems, that really challenged the old system. One of these social problems was poverty. Particularly people in the countryside, but also in the cities, there was a growing group of poor. Money, under the feudal system, wealth was basically land. That's what made you wealthy, was land, and what you could do with it. Under the new system, you could get very, very wealthy and store your wealth because of the increase in the use of money, of actual cash. The rise of the universities provided a very fertile ground for the spread of new ideas in other ways. So why not in the life of Christ too? Why should we not be looking for new ways to be Christian? And one thing that is often overlooked, there was a great rise because of what was going on in pilgrimages and the Crusades. It's important to remember that the Crusades were armed pilgrimages. That's how they described themselves. So all that led to the possibility, and indeed the fact, of the emergence of all sorts of dissenting groups inside the church and outside the church. And many of these people, these various types, heretics as well as Orthodox, really emphasized a high moral tone. And there come times when people are sick and tired of all the boundaries being loosed and dropped down and don't like what they see happening and say, we really should be living differently. I'm going to tell you about a few of these people just to give you the idea, the sense rather, of kind of what was going on. But before that, I want to introduce you to a particular scholar who had a big effect on how we come to understand it. His name was Jacques Verger. He died in 2017. Frenchman. I cannot overestimate Verger's influence in medieval history.
How do you spell his last name?
Verger. And he was specifically known. He was a very, very prolific writer. He lived a long time. He lived into his 80s and continued to work at the Sorbonne. He was the leading expert in the world on medieval universities. Prior to this point, people who wrote about medieval universities usually wrote about what were they teaching, who taught there, and who became influential studied there. He went much farther. He looked at firstly, he began by looking at the students and asking questions like, where did they come from? How did they live? What did they do when they weren't in class? How did they pay for their education? All this sort of thing. Really kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of the universities, but also the impact of the universities on the greater society. One of his best known books is called Men of Knowledge in the Middle Ages. And in it, he said that there was a transition. Up to this point, for a very long time, all of the learned people had been religious. There was no such thing as a lay intellectual. There were lay people who were very powerful, and so forth. But the intellectual life was dominated by clergy. And he described this as a transition from the monk scholar to the urban intellectual. And he came up with a particular phrase that I think really, really incorporates what's going on here. He said, it is indisputable that the 12th century was, with greater or lesser precocity and intensity, practically throughout the West, a time of cultural mutation. It was not so much revolution as mutation, because a lot of the old forms remained, but they had changed. So, here are some of the protagonists of the Reform were clergy. I've got some names here. I'm not even going to read them because they don't mean anything to me, and they wouldn't to you either. They held in common that they had all renounced a comfortable and successful clergy life to live an austere life of poverty, prayer, and penance. These guys were all great preachers, and they attracted a lot of followers. They did have conflicts with the ecclesiastical authorities, but they remained within the church. They were never run out. They were never burned at the stake. They were allowed to be in the church, and they had influence. But mostly what they did was found new monasteries that were living up to the ideals, the monastic ideals, in the way that they thought many of the monasteries that existed didn't. And these became real centers for spirituality. Lay people would go to them and spend time there. They would do retreats, and then they were preaching as well. Some of the lay origin reform movements did manage to integrate into the church. One of the more interesting ones came from Lombardy, northern Italy, so it would have had an impact on early Franciscan life. They were called the Humiliati, the low people of Lombardy. And they actually were divided into three groups: a community of men, a community of women living in community, so like monks and nuns, but also people living with their own families, third order. They lived by the work of their own hands. They farmed, they had crafts, they sold things. They supported themselves. And those living in community were also to observe chastity. They ran hospitals for the sick, and they did poor relief. They were condemned in 1184. But they appealed to Pope Innocent III, and after they had they developed a written rule of life, they were approved by him in 1201, and they were active for a number of centuries. But what about the heretics? Some preachers, in their desire for reform, advanced new and very radical doctrines, not necessarily heretical, but radical. And they ended up clashing with the authorities. One of these was a man named Henry of Lausanne. And Henry had been invited by the Bishop of Le Mans to preach, which he did. He was so good at it that his listeners attacked the clergy physically. So the bishop expelled him from his diocese, and he kept on as an itinerant preacher, wandering around preaching repentance and reform. He was arrested in 1135 and died in prison sometime after 1145. Another, who is much more extreme, is a man named Peter of Brie. Not B-R-I-E, like the cheese, B-R-U-Y-S. French is a funny language. There are a lot of things that are pronounced weirdly, as far as I'm concerned. He was a priest in southern France, and he was also another one of these itinerant preachers. And he preached radicalism and violence. He denied all material aspects of religion in favor of a completely spiritual church. He opposed infant baptism. Oddly enough, he opposed clerical celibacy. Most of these groups were pushed celibacy to some degree or other. He opposed the erecting or even the existence of churches. The veneration of crosses, the doctrine of transubstantiation, and prayers for the dead. He rejected the authority of all Scripture except the Gospels. He incited his listeners to attack priests, to desecrate or destroy churches, to burn crucifixes. In 1132, he was burned at the stake, not by the church, by a mob of angry lay people. But the most significant of these groups, and the one that was going to be the most significant in terms of the world in which Francis lived and mostly traveled, was the Waldensians. They were named after a man named Peter Waldo. Peter Waldo, like a lot of these guys, had been a very prosperous, well-off guy. He was a merchant in Lyon. And through reading a translation of the Gospels and other New Testament writings, he abandoned his family, gave all that he had to the poor, and became an itinerant preacher. He attracted many followers. They became known as the Waldensians, or sometimes as the poor men of Lyon. They lived in community, in poverty, chastity. Peter preached a return to gospel simplicity, but also criticized unworthy clergy and some of the practices of the church. He claimed that his calling did not come from the church, but from God directly. A contemporary described the Waldensians because he attracted a lot of followers. He said, they have no home of their own, walking in pairs. No, they weren't Mormons. Walking in pairs, barefoot, without provisions. They hold everything in common like the apostles and follow the naked Christ. He was forbidden to preach by the Bishop of Lyon. All the Waldensians were forbidden to preach. And they appealed to Rome during the Third Lateran Council of 1179. And their movement was approved on one condition. And the condition was that they seek authorization from bishops to preach within their dioceses. No bishops gave it. None. They continued to preach. So they were excommunicated in 1184. From that point on, they got increasingly weird in doctrine and much harsher in their attacks on religious authorities. And they created their own hierarchy of bishops, priests, and deacons. There was a split in the movement in 1210. Peter died. Peter himself died in 1217. Peter Valdo. And two of the groups that came out of this split actually reconciled with the church and became sort of not exactly standard Catholics, but they were in communication with the church. But others didn't, and they became incredibly strong in the Piedmont area and in other places in northern Italy. Various popes sent military expeditions against them to suppress or exterminate them. And then they would abandon their fertile farms in the valleys and go up in the mountains and fight back. None of those military expeditions succeeded. They hung on. They hung on for centuries. They were waging a sort of guerrilla warfare against any Catholics who attempted to convert them. Now, can we see, please, that picture that I've labeled Peter Martyr 1? Have you got that, Rick? Can you hear me?
He's working on it.
Peter Martyr 1. We'll get to this picture later because it's well received. No, that's not it. That's not it. That's not it. That's not. Yeah. Okay, that's it. This is a picture, a little medieval manuscript of Peter Martyr. He was a Dominican friar who had been sent as a missionary, and he was being very successful. So the Waldensians, and this is will show you how well organized they were. They didn't say, let's kill him. They said, let's hire some assassins to kill him. Some professional assassins, which they did. Thereby confusing and baffling tens of thousands of Protestant pilgrims who visit Catholic churches and say, who's the guy with the knife in his head?
Thank you.
That's Peter Martyr. And you'll sometimes see him with a knife, sometimes with an axe. He, by the way, he had the shortest period between death and canonization of anybody.
Is that how they killed him?
Pardon me?
Was that how they killed him?
Yes, he was attacked by these two assassins with blades. Okay, and the various pictures of him, some show different types of blades. We have an eyewitness account by another monk who was with him, and it's very detailed of the killing. Now, could we see Peter Martyr 2? Oh, is that Peter Martyr 2? I can't really see it. I'm sorry. No. That's not Peter Martyr. Peter Martyr 2, isn't it there? No. It should be right under Peter Martyr 1. Shoot, I hope it's there. I really want you to see this. Peter Martyr. Yeah, that one. That. Okay. You see this one? I'm not showing you this. You can see that he's got a wound in his head right here. You probably can't see it, but he does. But the reason I want you to see this, put it together, is because I think it's really charming. See what he's doing?
Yeah.
Know where this is? This is a Frangelico, by the way. There is a convent, a monastery, called Santa Croce in Florence, which was Dominican monks, and it was completely decorated by Frangelico, one of the really great artists of the early Renaissance. And this particular piece, it's a lunette, half moon, over a door. It's the door that leads into the refectory where the monks were, which leads into the chapel where the monks would go to worship. He'd sing, shh. So apparently the monks were a chatty bunch, and this was to remind them to be quiet. He chose Peter Mark. I'm sorry, I know it's not important, but I thought it was good. Anyhow, back to the Waldensians. They existed as a sort of semi-outlaw group up until 1848, when King Carlo Alberto, this is before Italy became a country. Italy became a country in 1861. King Carlo, who was the Count of Savoy, which is where they were, and the King of Sardinia, granted them civil and political rights. So for the first time, they could move out freely without fear of being denounced or beat up or whatever. Of all the medieval heretical movements, the Waldensians were the only ones to survive into modern times. All as an organized group. They became Calvinists, became Protestants, and they still exist. They are part of something which I did not know existed, called the Union of Methodist and Waldensian Churches. Now, how you square being a Methodist with Calvinist doctrine, I don't know. But the Waldensians were obviously very strong and very active during Francis's time, which began with his birth in 1181, we think. Francis's father was a Pietro de Bernardone. He was a cloth merchant with a wife who some say came from Provençal, southern France. When Francis was born, his father was away on a business trip to France. His mother had him baptized Giovanni. So he was Giovanni de Bernardone. But when his father came back, he changed the baby's name to Francesco, meaning Frenchman, either because he liked France or to remember that he'd been to France, or as perhaps to honor his mother's birthplace, or maybe just to show his wife who was boss. I don't know. He changed his name. Francis learned to read and write Latin. He acquired some knowledge of French and French literature, particularly fond of the Provençal troubadours, the wandering minstrels, who became such a factor in developing some of the musical and literary arts in southern France. For the rest of his life, he enjoyed speaking French, although his command was far from perfect, but he liked it. He was not much of a student. He was a frat boy type, okay? He was good looking, he was athletic, he had lots of money and liked to spend it. He dressed very fashionably, he gambled. He was not vicious, he was just a frat boy. Seriously, that's the best way I can characterize him. In 1202, he decided to take part in one of these wars between Assisi and another city, Parish. A lot of these city wars were dead serious. I mean, the Florentines really crippled Siena, but a lot of them were sort of halfway sports. You know, they were wars over slights given to one side or the other, or over certain rights that one wanted to exercise against the other, and they were almost like tournaments. Now, people got killed. Don't get me wrong. But it was sort of the sport of the nobility, and he thought, he was from the wealthy bourgeoisie, he'd take a shot at it. It didn't work too well for him. He got captured. He was held prisoner for almost a year, and after his release, his health had been apparently affected. He fell really seriously ill. Got better, decided to go to war again, this time with the Guelphs, the papal forces, against the Emperor Frederick II, who was in Italy. This was a serious war. And he was on his way to join the troops when he had a vision, or a dream. Some say one, some say the other. In which he was told to return to Assisi and wait for a call to a new type of knighthood, a new type of warfare. And he took this very seriously. I mean, he changed his life around right there. He went back to Assisi, as the vision had or dream had told him, and he dedicated himself to solitude and prayer. He lived a lot, lived rough a lot, didn't always stay at home. He wasn't preaching. He was seeking guidance as to what that meant. The new kind of knighthood, the new kind of warfare. There were several other episodes that happened during this period. One was a vision of Christ while he was praying in a grotto. One was an experience he had when he was on pilgrimage to Rome with nothing, dressed in rags, and he begged in front of St. Peter's Basilica. Another was an incident in which he gave alms to a man with leprosy. He had always had a horror of lepers. He found them disgusting and repulsive. And he gave alms to the leper and kissed his hand. But the most important and most famous of these, according to his disciple and first biographer, Thomas of Solano, occurred very famously at the ruined chapel of San Damiano, outside the gates of Assisi. As a side thing, there were a lot of little bitty ruined churches, because remember I told you that people were leaving the countryside going into the cities? So a lot of these little churches had been abandoned and deconsecrated, even some of them. Now, can we get that cross picture up again? The cross of San Damiano? I bet every person in here has seen this somewhere. Okay, there it is. Yeah, okay. Make that as big as it'll go, if you make it bigger. This is the cross of San Damiano. We don't know who made it. It's a painted cross. And it is in a style that is referred to as Syrian. There were Syrian monks in the area early, and this undoubtedly had been painted by one of them. It's very much in the Syrian style. And it's not what you think. It's not a crucifix. A crucifix is a depiction of the crucified Christ. This is a depiction of the risen Christ. There are no nails in his hands. There are wounds, or feet, wounds, but not nails. This long black thing here behind him represents the empty tomb. Up here, this is Christ's ascension and being greeted by angels. These are the people at the foot of the cross. St. John, St. Mary Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, and one other whom I can't remember. Here's this painted cross. This cross still exists. And I'll talk. Later, Francis was to found a group of women Franciscans called the Poor Clares, and they were housed in the Church of San Damiano. And when the Church of St. Clara was built in Assisi, they moved the cross there. You can see it. It's there. All right. According to Francis, while he was praying in front of this cross, it spoke to him. I want to be very clear about this. He does not say, I heard a voice in my head. He said the lips moved. And what he was told was, go, Francis, and repair my house, which, as you see, is nearly in ruins. Francis took this absolutely literally. He hurried home. He took some of the best cloth from his father's shop, rode off to a nearby town where he sold the cloth and the horse he rode in on, then walked back to San Damiano and tried to give the money to the priest who was there. He wouldn't take it. Apparently, maybe Francis had a bit of a reputation, but he thought, nope, can't do that. Nope. Francis threw the money out a window. His father was furious. Now, previous to this, Francis had on some occasions taken cloth out of his father's warehouses, sold it, and given the money to the poor. But this time, his father had really had enough. So he kept him at home and charged him with theft before the civil authorities. Francis refused to answer the summons. So then, Francis's father went to the Bishop of Assisi and charged him with theft. Francis showed up before the bishop at the bishop's court. And Francis, according to Thomas of Solano, there are different things about this. Before he'd even been charged by the bishop or anything else, just as soon as he showed up, took off all of his clothes, and threw them at the feet of his father, and then said, "Until now I have called you my Father on earth, but henceforth I can truly say, Our Father who art in heaven." The bishop gave him a cloak to cover his nakedness, and Francis walked out of the bishop's court, walked out of the city, and went off in the woods on Mount Sabastia, up above the city. From this point on, Florence lived what he thought was the apostolic life. He renounced all worldly goods. He renounced all family ties to embrace a life of extreme poverty. He did repair the church of San Damiano, mostly with his own hands. I don't know exactly what that means. I don't know exactly what the details were. But he began to attract people, just as a lot of these earlier folks had done, men who wanted to live the same way. While he was attending Mass in one of these churches, which becomes rather important later, it's known as the Porziencola, which means the little portion. It's a very small little church, and it was given to Francis and the Franciscans by the Augustinian monks. He restored it, and he was there hearing Mass in 1208. It was the Feast of St. Matthew. And the gospel for that day, the gospel appointed for that day is from Matthew 10. It's Jesus speaking to his disciples. "And as ye go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Provide neither gold, nor silver, nor brass in your purses, nor scrip for your journey, neither 2 coats, neither shoes, nor yet staves," walking sticks. "For the workman is worthy of his meat. And into whatsoever city or town ye shall enter, inquire who in it is worthy, and there abide till ye go thence." This is when Jesus sends the disciples out preaching, and then they come back to him later. According to Thomas, Francis declared, "This is what I wish. This is what I am seeking. This is what I want to do from the bottom of my heart." He then took off his shoes, threw away his staff, put on a tunic of the lowest quality, and began to go out and preach. It's from this point that he's preaching. And he's preaching repentance. He preached to townspeople. He did not have a license to do so. He was a layman. He attracted followers. In 1209, he composed for his disciples a very simple rule. It survives. It's known as the regula primitiva, the primitive rule. It's kind of loose. It's mostly passages from the Bible, including, of course, that one. And it states that the way to salvation is to follow the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ and to walk in his footsteps. Eventually, he led his group, interestingly, 12, disciples to Rome to seek the approval of Innocent III. Now, this is important because it shows something that people tend to forget about Francis or not want to. As I say, Francis is every Protestant's favorite saint. Francis always recognized papal authority. And he was the other thing that is often overlooked in Francis is how central to his preaching and teaching the Eucharist is. He had an absolute commitment to the idea that the Eucharist was the presence of Christ. Anyhow, this at first Innocent was very hesitant because Francis looked a lot like a lot of these heretics, and he was being really radical in his commitment to poverty. And he was preaching, but he had a dream. Innocent had a dream. And in this dream, he saw something very simple. He saw the Church of St. John Lateran. And if you all know, the Church of St. John Lateran is not in Vatican City. It's in Rome. But it's the official home, not home. It's the official church of the papacy because it's the first one. It predates Vatican City, okay? And there's a great, in some of the frescoes in the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, there's a really nice fresco by Frangelico.
Frangelico or
Yes.
Giotto?
No, by Frangelico. A fresco by Frangelico that shows the Church of St. John Lateran leaning like this, like it's collapsing. And Thomas is standing about here, holding the church up. And that was enough for Innocent. He, on April 16, 1210, he approved the Franciscan rule of life, obviously licensed them to preach. The Franciscans keep this day as the official founding of the Franciscan order. Okay. They were known as the Friars Minor, which means the lesser brothers. They were street preachers. They had no possessions, and the only place they owned, or the place that was their center, was the Porciuncola, that little church. This term friars means brothers, the lesser brothers. They were not monks. They were very distinct from monks because they did not live in community. They met in community, but they were sent out preaching. That was their job, to go out. They were street preachers, yeah. They preached and worked first in Umbria, which is that portion of Italy, the center portion there. And their numbers grew incredibly. There was something in the air, and there was something about Francis. Their numbers did grow amazingly, phenomenally. And that led to problems. One problem that it led to, and I'm serious about this, men saying, yes, I'm called to do this, and leaving their families destitute. The other problem was, Francis, you see how Francis' life up to this point was very much focused on his own relationship to God, not organization, not founding things. You know, it just happened. Francis became, we'll talk more about that later. You'll see what it'll lead to. Francis, the only thing, I can only compare him to two things contemporaneously. One is, he was a rock star. Everywhere he went, people wanted to touch him. People wanted to hear him preach. People wanted to see him. People wanted him to heal their sick and so forth. And the other thing, he's almost like a cult leader. Even though Francis himself is absolutely dedicated to Christ and trying to be like Christ and trying to, as he said, follow the life of Christ and his teachings. People put a huge emphasis on him. His preaching was very emotional. He preached with fervor. And his favorite themes seem to me to be, firstly, poverty as the highest way of life and the surest road to salvation. You've got to renounce the world and everything in it. Okay? You got to just dump it. It's all rubbish. The need for repentance, the tortures of the damned, the sufferings of Christ, with which he could preach, on which he could preach very, very eloquently, and devotion to the person. Those were his main themes. Francis moved around Italy, not all of it, but various parts of it, and finally thought he believed he was called to take the message out of Italy. Now, he already had Franciscans working in other countries, going around, living by begging, owning nothing, living the way he was living.
Randolph, did they go separately, one at a time, or did they go in
Usually
groups
in
of
twos.
12?
No, not in groups of 12. Usually in twos,
Okay.
sometimes others. There was no rule about that. There weren't rules about much yet. In the late spring of 1212, he decided to go to the Holy Land to preach to the Muslims. He didn't get there. He was shipwrecked, and he had to return home. A year or two later, he decided to go visit the Muslims in Spain, preach to the Muslims in Spain. And again, sickness forced him to abandon that journey. In 1217, he was getting ready to leave for France when Cardinal Ugolino, who later became Gregory IX, who had been a big supporter of the order. He protected them against charges of heterodoxy and heresy and so forth. He advised Francis that he was needed more in Italy. And Francis, who was always pretty as obedient as his personal visions allowed him to be to people of rank in the church, he said he stayed in Italy. In 1219, he actually did go to Egypt. What was happening is there was a crusade on, and the Crusaders were besieging the port of Damietta. The siege was eventually unsuccessful. Damietta was an important port city. And he went there and actually went into the Muslim city, into Damietta. And he preached to the Sultan who was there, Sultan Al-Kamid. Al-Kamid treated him courteously, was a little bemused by him, probably thought he was nuts, and was not convinced. But he let him go. He didn't chop his head off. So Francis came back home. Why did he come back home? Because news had been brought to him of serious dissensions among the friars. Remember I said it, rapid growth? Okay. Lack of organization internally. And this was causing big problems. The Order of the Friars Minor, as they were known, they had grown at a faster rate than any previous religious order in the history of the church. I don't know exactly how many there were, but there were a whole lot of. They didn't know how many they were, because Franciscans were making Franciscans, sometimes far away from where Francis was. It had virtually no organizational infrastructure. It seems to me it was less of an order than a loose association who had been inspired to follow Francis' example of life and what they saw as the principles and practices of the apostles. And they really had little more than Francis' example and that very brief and not very specific primitive rule that he had written. So to correct this, Francis prepared a new and more detailed rule for Franciscans. This is referred to as the regula non bullata, the rule without a bull. It doesn't mean a cow, okay? Bull is from the Latin bulla, which means seal. And when a pope issues anything authoritative, it's sealed with the papal seal, sealed with his ring, I think. And that's why we refer to those as bulls. Well, this was never submitted to a pope, or if it was it's kind of, we know that it existed, and we know that it never was officially approved by a pope. But that's why it's known as the rule without a bull. This rule reasserted an absolute insistence upon both individual and corporate poverty, and included some more specific instructions regarding rules of behavior and organization. Still wasn't, I don't think any lawyer would pass muster, if it passed muster with any lawyer, but he was trying to tighten up. The distinction here between individual and corporate poverty is this. Among many of the monastic orders, there was a rule of poverty. But that was interpreted to mean no individuals, whereas the community as a community could own a whole lot. And that's why some of the monasteries were so wealthy. If you think about it, if you've got a flourishing institution, whether it's religious or not, and it's attracting a lot of financial support, people leaving it stuff in wills, often leaving it land, leaving it money, giving it stuff. Well, individuals die and eventually their stuff gets dispersed. But organizations don't. Well, they do, but they have a long lifespan. Some of these monasteries have been around for hundreds of years at this point. They were extremely wealthy. So he said individual and corporate poverty. And he was very insistent on it. Francis had begun to withdraw from the leadership role. Some people feel that he was just aging and getting tired, but he wasn't really that old. Other people say he was disgusted, that things had gotten out of his control, that he was being asked, he was being forced to do things that he didn't really feel he was called to, that he felt that what he was called to was a life of poverty and radical obedience to the apostolic life, following the naked Christ. And indeed, for whatever reason, he was definitely withdrawing. He actually appointed a fellow named Peter Catanii as his vicar, his second in command, to handle all of the order's practical and administrative affairs. This Peter of Catanii was one of his first two followers. The first two men to come to Francis and say, we want to be with you, we want to be like you, were Peter Catanii and his brother. So, he knew Francis's mind the way probably nobody else did. But he died in 1221, and immediately Francis replaced him with another brother. So he's becoming like a European president. What really matters is the prime minister. He's not exactly a figurehead. He's still the spiritual leader, but the details are being handled by other people. 2 years later, he rewrote the rule again. The second rule is known as the second rule, the regular, or sometimes the regula bullata, the rule with a bull, because he submitted this one to the Pope, and the Pope approved it. This rule, and I have to wonder to what extent Brother Elias, who was the new vicar, contributed to this, much more specific regulations for disciplining, for preaching, and for being allowed to become a Franciscan. very specific stuff. All right, it's authorities getting consolidated. After this, Francis withdrew increasingly from any external affairs, spending more and more time in private prayer and devotion, long periods out in the countryside, not preaching, just being. In 1223, Francis participated in an important ceremony, and it's one that has had an enduring influence long after Francis's death, including on this parish. There was a church in a place called Greccio, and there was a wealthy merchant there who was very attached to Francis. He wasn't a Franciscan. He was but he was a very wealthy guy. And Francis wrote him with some instructions. He said he wanted him to put something in the church there, and Francis, would worship there. Francis, by this time, we don't know exactly when this happened, but he became ordained as a deacon. That made he could preach anywhere a bishop would let him preach. He never became a priest, but he was a deacon. And he said he would come and worship at this church on Christmas Day. What he had him build was a creche. It's the first Christmas creche.
Huh.
And that's where they all come from Francis of Assisi. I'm surprised more of y'all didn't know that. Later, the next year, 1224, Francis withdrew again. He went to a place called Laverna, which is not far from Assisi. It's up in the mountains. It's an area, not a city, okay? His intention was to undertake a fast of 40 days. Francis didn't eat much anyhow, and, it would be tough. He went there, he said, to pray that he might know how best to please God. And 3 times upon opening his gospel book at random, bibliomancy, bad practice, don't do it. 3 times he came upon references to the sufferings of Christ. Crucifixion, scourging, all that. And he prayed fervently. And as he was praying, on the morning of September 14th, he believed he beheld a figure coming toward him from the heavens. Mm-hmm. Now, St. Bonaventure, whom I'll talk about later, he became the minister general. That's the head of the order after Francis's death. Not immediately, there were a few others in between. But Bonaventure is so important in the history of the Franciscans. He's referred to as the second founder. Anyhow, Bonaventure describes what happened, what he saw, this way. As it stood above him, he saw that it was a man and yet a seraph. Seraph, order of angels, the ones with the 6 wings that stand up, okay. A seraph with 6 wings. His arms were extended and his feet conjoined, and his body was fixed to a cross. 2 wings were raised above his head, 2 were extended as in flight, and 2 covered the whole body. The face was beautiful beyond all earthly beauty, and it smiled gently upon Francis. Conflicting emotions filled his heart, but though the vision brought great joy, the sight of the suffering and crucified figure stirred him to deepest sorrow. Pondering what this vision might mean, he finally understood that by God's providence he would be made like to the crucified Christ, not by a bodily martyrdom, but by conformity in mind and heart. Then, as the vision disappeared, it left not only a greater ardor of love in the inner man, but no less marvelously marked him outward with the stigmata of the crucified. Now, stigmata, I'm going to talk about a little bit. This is the first instance of stigmata. By the way, there's a picture of two arms crossed, if you can find this one. The stigmata are marks that appear on the hands, feet, and sides sometimes, right, mimicking the wounds of Christ. Sometimes they're not marks. Catherine of Siena, who never showed in marks, experienced great pain in those areas. Maybe she was arthritic, I don't know. In any event, there's real controversy about stigmata. And undoubtedly, there have been people who faked it one way and another. But there have been a few hundred cases through the centuries that were pretty well attested to. And of course, as you get closer and closer to modern times, you get more and more medical people looking into it. And we do know that there is such a thing as somatization. Somatization is a medical term which means, soma means body in Greek. It means that things that are happening inside you have effects on your body, often fairly extreme effects. This receiving of the stigmata is very, very important to the Franciscans. It is so important that this is one of their most significant symbols. It's really kind of the symbol of the Franciscans. It shows, these are clouds, that's the cross. This is the hand of Christ. This is the hand of Francis. You see he's wearing the brown robe of the Franciscans, and their wounds in both palms. Francis's wounds were pretty extreme. They were both sides of his hands and his feet, and they did cause him pain, as well as on his side. During his lifetime, he did not he tried to hide them. Apparently he feared they would be taken as a sign of pride. His monks knew, some of them knew that he had them. But after his death, one of his monks who wrote an eyewitness account of his death said, he looked as if he were the body of a crucified man. Now, there are problems with getting to grips with Francis. You might suspect that, given that Francis was so incredibly popular in his own lifetime, there would be no shortage of documents allowing us to say we know a great deal about him. Well, you're right about there being no shortage of documents, but you'd be wrong about allowing us to say we know a great deal about him. And here are a few reasons why. Immediately after his death, stories of the miracles of Francis and various interactions with people began to circulate, and his admirers began to write down these stories and stories of his life and collections of anecdotes. Some of these stories were represented by these writers as being eyewitness accounts, but others, many others, were essentially hearsay with vague details as to time or place or the identities of the people involved. Once Francis met a woman up in a city near a mountain, that sort of thing. They're hearsay. Cassette stories, well, it's fair to say that the admirers of Francis did not apply any rigorous standards of proof. They just passed them along. The process of canonization began almost immediately after Francis's death. In reference to that process, Pope Gregory charged the task of writing the biography to a Franciscan friar whom I've named before, Thomas de Solano. He'd been a companion to Francis since at least 1215. He must have been a really fast worker, because he was charged in 1228 with writing a biography of Francis as part of the canonical approval of sainthood. And he finished it in February of 1229. So, wow, all right. It was approved, and the Pope declared it to be the official biography of Francis of Assisi. 15 years later, he wrote a second life of St. Francis, after having, quote, meditated on his holiness. This one included more anecdotes that Thomas knew only secondhand, and it may well have omitted some stories that had been included in the first biography. Wow. Well, remember I talked about the tensions within the order? The order had split. There were now two groups of Franciscans. One were referred to as the spirituals, and the other as the conventuals. The spirituals were the ones who wanted to be like Francis. They wanted to be itinerant preachers, own nothing, have no permanent home. Those were the purists, okay? The conventuals, well, they thought, modern times deserve different things, and if we're going to really work well, we're going to need a little money. And, it doesn't really work just to not have permanent homes. We need to, okay. They wanted to turn the Franciscans into more of a standard order, more like the other orders. So, quite frankly, the conventuals won. And the modern Franciscans and various offshoots of them are all pretty much like the conventuals. When's the last time you saw a barefoot guy in a brown habit out begging? It's been a while, right? Yeah. So the spirituals lost. The conventuals won. And a lot of the stricter teachings of Francis didn't really fit real well. So the second Vita, the second biography, may well have omitted some stories. Nevertheless, all sorts of new unofficial stories about Francis continued to spring up, and sometimes they'd find their way into print. The papal response to this was to commission yet another Vatican-approved official biography. And that's the one that was published, that was written by Bonaventura, later Saint Bonaventura, who was also a Franciscan. And in 1266, not only was his version declared by the papacy to be the only biography of Francis to have papal approval, it was also ordered that all previous biographical materials regarding Francis were to be destroyed. Wow. Yeah. Well, it's not so easy to destroy all the copies of popular writings. And some of these were very, very popular. But they gave it a good shot. And for centuries, scholars were mostly trying to piece together some of the older works from fragmentary manuscripts or things quoted in other books, trying to sort of reverse engineer the whole thing. Well, they did pretty well. But a lot of things were matters of opinion and either or. It was not like we had all those early doctrines because we didn't. So what do we have? Well, one thing that wasn't destroyed were the things that Francis had written, because they weren't biographical materials. So we've got, the rules that he wrote, another thing that he wrote shortly before his death called his Testament, and some letters. So these were actually written by Francis, and they still exist. We've got fragments of the first life that Thomas of Salerno wrote. We've got fragments of the second life, and something called the Legend of the Three Companions, which was written by three brothers who were close companions of Francis, which do include some intimate details of his early life and conversion. Unfortunately, you just can't. There's no way. There's nothing to test them against. So there they are. All right. And as I say, the suppression of the secular works almost certainly had to do with the tension between the spirituals and the conventuals. The victories of the conventuals made it prudent, diplomatic, convenient to overlook or even purge some of Francis's extremely strict advice, rules, and practices, especially that poverty thing. Now, in 2013, something very interesting happened. There's a picture labeled book. If you put that up, please. There's a book here that, where is it? It's in there somewhere. I wish I knew how to do this. You should have something labeled book. Nope, that's not it. Well, anyhow, I'll describe it to you. It is a little book about 200 pages, and it's about this big. And it's got teeny tiny writing, so these guys must have had really, really good optics. It is a version of, that's it. You see how tiny the writing is? Now think about that little bitty book.
Wow.
Yeah, right. Okay, it's a manuscript. It's not an illuminated manuscript. There are no pictures. And it includes what we think is a not quite complete version of the Second Life that Thomas wrote. So this is good. Why so tiny? I mean, you think of medieval books as being big things, and most of them were. Well, we think that this book, which was put up for auction by a house in France without knowing what it was, an American scholar saw pictures of it, got in touch with a professor at the Sorbonne and said, I don't have enough money for this, but I bet you guys do, and they bought it. And it's in, not the Sorbonne, the National Library of France. It's there. We think it was a book that was prepared to be used by Franciscans when they went out preaching. Okay, so this is what the rule is. This is the second rule. It's really made it. It's there's still a lot of problems, but it's a lot better than anything that we had before. But it is the Second Life, which was already probably very different. Part of the problem with getting a grip on Francis is this, what is known, not by its practitioners, but by critics, as, this is a great phrase, pious fraud. Pious fraud means attempting to enhance the prestige and importance of a written work or a story about an important figure by falsely attributing it to that figure. The classic example of this, and one with which most of you should be familiar, is the book of Hebrews in the Bible. If you look in the King James Version, it'll say St. Paul's epistle to the Hebrews. Mm-hmm. The chance that Paul wrote that are about as good as the chances that I wrote the Declaration of Independence. Neither the contents, nor the style, nor the language, nor anything else is anything like anything we know Paul wrote. But it was a common practice. For a while, it stopped being common practice, really. I don't think any reputable scholar today would even think about it. But in a sense, it's pious fraud. Well, fraud is not just a thing of the past. It's so common on the internet that there's even an internet in-joke about it. I'm sure some of you have seen it. You know, it's a quotation, it's in quotation marks. The problem with the internet is that there are too many false quotations, and then it's attributed variously to Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, all right. But it predates the internet by a long time. and it's always been around. I mean, there are so many stories about Yogi Berra saying things. One of which is, and I love this one. I know he did say this. He said, a lot of what I said, I've never said. Because there are all sorts of things attributed. Similarly, there are many, many popular stories and quotes attributed to St. Francis that, according to both the National Catholic Reporter and the Franciscan Mission Service, so that's the official voice of the Franciscans, this was a joint statement, are historically inaccurate modern inventions or embellishments. Here are a few of them. I'm going to leave with one that is particularly embarrassing to me because I did not know before I started this that he had not said this, and I'm a fool because I should have known it. Preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. That's totally non-Franciscan. He preached all the time. He loved words. He was good at it. He didn't do it. No, we don't know who did. Another one, very popular. The peace prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. We know where that came from.
I have to take Jane
It
home now.
appeared in a French magazine in 1912.
Oh, no.
It's a French Catholic magazine called La Clochette, and it was just called A Beautiful Prayer to Say During the Mass.
It is beautiful.
It is, but it ain't Francis. There's another quote you'll often hear attributed to him. We don't know who started this one. Start by doing what's necessary, then do what is impossible. No, it's not Francis. And finally, among the top, these are the top ones, things that people might know. The Serenity Prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference. That was written by an American, Reinhold Niebuhr, famous theologian.
Sure.
But one of the all-time greats for pushing these kind of things around is a book called The Little Flowers of St. Francis. There are 53 very short chapters, each of which is an incident revolving around Francis. Okay. The text is anonymous. It was composed at the end of the 14th century, using as its primary source a book which had been written in 1390, or the earliest manuscript being 90. The reason I include it here is firstly because it really did have a lot of influence for a long time. People told stories about Francis out of this book that just weren't so.
What is that?
It's the wind.
Pardon?
Wind.
The wind.
They were
Oh.
warning us about?
They were warning us about high winds.
Yeah.
Well, this book was referred to. This book, The Little Flowers, was referred to by Arthur Livingston, who was actually edited a 1930s edition of it. He was a notable expert in the field. He called it a masterful work of folk literature from the Middle Ages, and that's what it is. It's folk literature.
What about his preaching to the birds? And the
Yeah, I
animals?
wanted to know that
I'm
too.
getting there.
Get
Two
to
of
the good
these
stuff.
stories. Well, there are two stories about they're new Francis preaching to birds. Francis was a great anthropomorphizer. That is to say, he attributed human attributes to all sorts of things: animals, plants, inanimate objects, brother sun, sister moon, brother fire, sister death. If they're your brother and sister, then they're human, right? And there are two stories about him preaching to birds. The lesser known one is him trying to preach somewhere, and the birds were making too much noise, and he preached to them about shutting up and listening. And the other one is a little different. It appears in a couple of different versions, but basically that he preached to the birds, telling them to be grateful to God for this and this, if they should know God and praise Him. There are a couple of different interpretations to this coin on the ground, and they saw a man begging. And one of the brothers said, I'm going to give this to that guy, and picked it up. And the other brother said, you better not do that. Francis wouldn't like it. He wouldn't, you know, no. Nothing to do with money. You know, we think of Francis, and when you start looking at these stories, some of them are pretty over the top. And there's another, but one we know, we're pretty sure is actually a fact. He advised his mom, his friars, pardon me, that they should not take any pleasure in food. And when they begged, they were allowed to receive food. Garments is something to eat that looks too good. Pour cold water over it. Otherwise it will please you. Now, this to me is not, as a Christian, I think that God put a lot of things on earth that He intended us to enjoy. And He looked at them and called them good. And yes, you can overindulge in anything. Yes, you can abuse what God wants you in the search for pleasure. But it does mean you shouldn't take any pleasure of life. Francis wore the coarsest possible clothing, much patch. By the way, could you put up, Rick, please, that picture that you had up in the beginning? This is another really, Francis's emphasis on poverty also embraced intentional suffering, voluntary suffering. And I really want to talk about this painting. I'm sorry, I know I'm holding y'all, but this is too good to miss. Okay.
We lost power, so this is when the lights flash. So he's
It's really bad out right now.
Okay, well, then we'll stay here till it passes.
What about ice cream? Only if you keep talking.
I mean, don't worry, no problem. Probably shut me up.
there you go. All right, we got it.
Oh, good. Good. No, not that picture. The one of poverty, the allegory of poverty. Yeah, if you can pop that up in for me. This is another Giotto. It's very different from most of his. I'll ask Rick to leave this up so you can come and look at it closely. We're going to talk about it. Francis talked about poverty as my lady and my bride. This is the allegory of poverty by Giotto. It's a fresco. And you can't really see the details, so trust me on this, okay? This is Francis. Why he's wearing black, I don't know. Franciscan robes are brown. And this is Jesus, and this is poverty. Look at her. She's dressed in rags. Her face is not really beautiful. It looks tired and careworn. She's standing in thorns, okay? But behind her, there are beautiful flowers, right? And the allegory is that the only way to get here is to go through the necessary suffering. There's what I can only describe as a masochistic streak in medieval Christianity and often, and this is pretty extreme. I mean, Francis wanted, and at the end of his life, he returned very thoroughly to this idea that the only way to follow Christ was to own nothing, to live by begging. Well, let me ask you. No, this is a very rhetorical question. What kind of world would it be if every Christian decided to do that? Who would you beg from?
Yeah.
The Russians and the Chinese.
As long as we were around. Francis never intended to be. Francis did not intend to found a movement, much less an institution, but it happened. And by the way, there are Anglican Franciscans. They're all conventuals, of course. But Francis, the Francis that seems to appeal to so many people, is a Francis that is mentally constructed by subtracting from the real Francis a lot of things that were there, and adding to the real Francis a lot of things that weren't there. For instance, you'll hear it over and over, well, Francis was a vegetarian, to which my response is, so was Hitler. He wasn't. He was not a vegetarian. He hated vermin. It was the one thing in the created world that he hated. He hated mice, and he hated biting insects. Okay. You will hear that Francis was an ecologist. Oh, please. In fact, John Paul II actually made him patron saint of ecologists. No, really, he did, which is just silly. I mean, that was, Francis believed himself to be somehow united to nature, to animals, to inanimate objects, even to abstract ideas, as I've said, which is why he anthropomorphized them. He had a profound influence on the church. And by and large, it was a benign influence. And certainly the Franciscan order had a wonderful influence on the church. They did for centuries set, and do continue in many ways, set an example of selfless service, particularly to the poor. Teaching, running hospitals, feeding, all sorts of things. They became they were some of the very first missionaries, even before the Jesuits, to the various people in the various conquered peoples in Spanish America. So, you can't say that Francis was, that he was a bad influence in the long run. He wasn't. But his memory has been co-opted by so many groups by which he would be appalled, and which may never make any reference to his emphasis on obedience to the papacy, and his emphasis on the importance of the Eucharist, to which he was absolutely devoted. That the figure they've constructed for their own purposes is a long way from the real Francis. The real Francis was a product of his times and the needs of his times, and you have to take him seriously. You really do. He's never been less than popular from the day he began to attract attention. But really, in a perfectly balanced world, I think, he would still be a controversial figure. And he's a figure to be admired, but it would be disastrous if everyone were to imitate him. It really would.
Well, there's three things in the life of Jesus that seem to give the lie to the extreme poverty. One is the creation of the wonderful wine.
Yep.
And then the other is his acceptance of being anointed with extremely valuable perfume. Yep. And then his garment at his crucifixion was such a high quality that the soldiers didn't want to tear it up. They gambled for who was going to get it.
Well, I'd say there were many others. Jesus was very happy to eat and drink with rich men. And coming to which there is a story, and this is one that's well attested. Thomas was invited to a big dinner, a banquet dinner. I forget what the attraction was. I mean, what the occasion was, by a cardinal. So this is, this is an honor. And in preparation for that dinner, he went around begging for food. And when he got to the dinner, he went around and placing on the plates of the people at the table, the other guests, scraps that he'd been given of bread, meat, veggies, whatever. No, I completely agree. I'm not arguing, believe me, I'm not arguing for voluntary poverty. I've seen real poverty. We lived in Africa, okay? Mm-hmm. And it's not ennobling, and it doesn't necessarily bring you closer to God. It depends on how you react to it. It makes a lot of people into absolute dragons. So, no, you're absolutely correct. There are a lot of different types of spirituality depending on what one's needs are. And I think it is always dangerous to assume that what one person is called to is what another is called to. And I really think there are a lot of people who would be much more happy as monks or nuns than they are out in the world. But we don't believe that anymore. What the culture teaches is that that's wrong, and that that's unnatural. But I think there are a lot of people who probably would be better off if they were, if that were the case. But God made everybody different, and there are certainly general principles, and there's some good solid rules. But when you start building on those, you better be careful what you build and be able to distinguish universals from particulars.
Father,
sir,
what is the naked Jesus?
The idea is the crucified Christ. Okay? And, I remember somebody saying, you'll never see a real accurate depiction of crucifixion, because Roman custom and what Scripture tells us is that they took away his garments. They didn't say except for. Okay? And it was Roman custom to crucify people, usually naked. It was a further humiliation. Ma'am?
Did the church the church at large, have any diminishment as due to Francis into less excess and less lavish? I get the idea.
You mean, did they tone it down?
Yeah, did they tone it down?
No,
did they do
not really.
anything?
Well,
Okay.
some did. Yeah, sure. Some did. But there had always been, even long before Francis, there had been some priests and bishops who took poverty seriously, or who at least lived simply. But when any institution gets really successful, and bear in mind, the church's been here for over 1,000 years, you're going to attract people who are basically careerists.
Yeah.
They're in it to get what they can get and to climb the tree. And maybe not 100%, I don't mean they're villains, but that's part of their calculations. Mm-hmm. And that's true of the clergy, for God's sake, right now. There are always people who want to be clergy because they think it'll give them status, and that'll be a relatively easy, people are stupid. They think it'll be a stress-free life. They're living in a past that never was.
Yeah.
Where everybody liked the clergy, and all you had to do to be good clergy was be nice. Mm-hmm. And I never tried that. But
you only work on Sunday.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you don't get it. I've always heard it.
Yeah.
You get all those
I
dinners.
think you get it in any large, successful, secure organization. And so there were plenty of people there. And then there are also among the higher ranks, the nobility. You look through significant people like Bonaventure, or people who became bishops and abbots and so on. Almost all of them, not all, but almost all, were from the upper classes to start with. Mm-hmm. And these were positions of wealth and power, corporate wealth, but still wealth. And they sort of were seen as the normal people to do that. Mm-hmm. The old joke about, what was it in England, under the rights of primogeniture, the oldest son inherits everything. Yeah, the first son gets the land, the second son becomes a lawyer, the third son becomes a soldier, and the fourth son becomes a priest, you know. That was, yeah, this idea that it's very different from these medieval movements, including Franciscan, which were a radical obedience and a complete selflessness. And you know, I know some of you probably think I've been kind of hard on Francis, and in some ways I guess I have. But you can't help but admire certain aspects of what he did and take it seriously. Again, I think he was a saint. That doesn't mean he was perfect. And in many ways, he's one of the most interesting figures in the Middle Ages. And yet, you kind of wonder sometimes, should I feel happy for him or should I pity him? I mean that. I really mean it.
How did he die? Did he
just
just
died of his
okay.
eyes. He died for the last 2 years of his life. He was completely blind. He had picked up an eye disease, I think in Egypt, somewhere. Some people say the Holy Land, but I know that it was endemic in Egypt. And he gradually went blind for the last couple of years, and he was in very bad shape. And so he died. Oh, I'm going to say, as I said, when he died, he knew he was dying. It was obvious. And he asked to be carried to the Portiuncula, that little church I told you all about. Okay. And that's where he died. Immediately after his death, they took his body to Assisi because they were afraid that his body would be taken apart for relics because he was so famous. His mothers did that. Later, not all that much later either, around the Portiuncula, they built the Basilica of St. Thomas, which is enormous. The Portiuncula is enclosed within it, and he's still buried there. He's buried in the Basilica. Francis would hate that thing. I mean, if you want to see the richness of the church, go there. Is this still up?
Yeah.
Could you show them the picture that's labeled, I think, relics? Something like that. Right now, okay? For 1 month, the what that is. For 1 month, the remains of Francis have been placed in a plexiglass box. And for 1 month, there are pilgrimages to view and pray before his bones. That's all that's left, his bones.
And look at that line.
It started in March. It will end in 6 days, I think. Why now? It's the 800th anniversary of his death. If the current rate of I checked this out today. If the current rate of visitation continues, 13,000 plus a day.
A day.
Over 400,000 people will have seen it in a month. Yeah, and you know, you can think what you like about relics and stuff, but you cannot argue against that as a sign of the enduring importance and significance of Francis of Assisi. So
where is this museum room or church or
Assisi?
Oh, it's in
the
Assisi.
cathedral. It's not a cathedral. It's a basilica. I keep calling it a
And
cathedral.
how do you spell the Portiuncula?
Let me look. It's the Italian word for a small portion. So you ought to know.
Well,
Martha speaks today. Let me see. it in here somewhere.
It's been a rough night for Jamie.
Yes, PORZIUNCOLA.
Okay. Porzione Cola.
Yeah, Kula. C-U-L-A.
Oh, C-U-L-A, sorry.
There's a Sicilian word that's very similar to that.
Porzione Cola.
No, not that one. I know a little of
Not from Cool.
it. It's the same in Neapolitan. Well, I know I kept y'all late, and I know I started late. I just screwed up. It was totally my fault. I left without some things I needed. I screwed up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm not trying to run y'all. Oh, and by the way, yeah, right. We will not meet next Monday because it's a vestry meeting, which is unfortunate because I really would have liked to follow on immediately with St. Dominic, but it is not to be. However, I do want to thank you all for being willing, like me, to ignore all this panic the populace stuff about the weather. And do drive home carefully. I'm not trying to run you out. I'm just saying I recognize that all of you had to brave the TV guys claiming that we were about to see the fifth one.
It was Monday, so that's why.
You know, my mother
would go with other civilian
that's just like a bracket. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
on these bus trips.
Yep.
It shows policies. In the hope that, you know, some kids from their school
Yeah, exactly.
choose to go there as a result of nice things. So that's
Yeah, that's right.
and with, private schools, private schools show